Choose your fire. Peter, Peter, Peter. This is all about Peter, which is to say, it's all about us. I thank you for this invitation to offer Lenten reflection and liturgy this day in this lovely historic sanctuary, which, along with the other lovely historic sanctuary just down the road, is now making and working toward combined service and ministry, warming hands together before one fire. My association with your two fires, here today, together, one fire, is very long and very heartfelt. Caesarea Philippi is the setting for today's story from Mark. What a place. An imperial administrative town, the Washington or Moscow of its day, Caesar's town named after Philip, son of Herod. This is Mark's gospel, the earliest, the shortest, the closest thing we have to the real deal, the least embellished, we are told. But that doesn't make it easy, either to understand or to accept. Not for Peter the sore thumb at this point, not yet Peter the rock, not for us either. Caesarea Philippi, where the orders for a crucifixion would come from, designed to be maximally humiliating. The condemned must carry the crosspiece of his own cross through the jeering crowd and die slowly and painfully by exposure on that cross. Mark commences a familiar but all too awkward call and response in just that setting, placed in the text by no accident, I think, right after Jesus restores sight to a blind man. Jesus, who do they say I am? Disciples. Elijah, John the Baptist, a prophet. In other words, not the one. Jesus, who do you say that I am? Peter, the one, the anointed one. Jesus, say nothing about this. Modern liberal scholars, Crossan, Borg, doubt this interaction, by the way, noting that Jesus, in his clearest, most authoritative sayings, never refers to himself. So we go on in that text to more call and response. Jesus, the Son of Man, the son of Adam, must suffer, be rejected, killed, and rise on the third day. Now, there are three quite distinct uses of son of Adam in Hebrew scriptures, and another three in the Christian references, and so exact clarity on that word and term may not immediately jump forward. Peter, words not recorded, but he rebukes Jesus. Jesus rebukes Peter. Get behind me, Satan. And then the great teaching calls the crowd and the disciples, says, to be my followers, you must deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow me. Again, modern scholars suggest the original language is likely less self-reflective. In other words, disciples of a way, followers of a way, must give up selfish self-interest, take up the cross, more on that one, and become true followers of the way. This ends with the save or lose your life teaching, which might originally have been something like this. If you want to be restored from sightlessness, you must be prepared to give up your own blindness to the truth. Scholars believe sight was the reference point for saving your life. This is the first reference in Scripture to the cross, and that's a big reason why it's part of our Lenten readings. But what cross for Peter and for us? I ask because there are two specific cross possibilities here. The particular future cross on which Jesus would die, and the more general cross of imperial humiliation and torture on which many had already died, and two more would die along with Jesus. The imperial powers reserved crucifixion for those they considered lowest. Generally, Roman citizens were not condemned to crucifixion, but their slaves were. Josephus, the Jewish historian, says the Romans crucified thousands of people, slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state. The two thieves alongside Jesus were likely slaves. Jesus was an enemy of the state. Here's a little sidebar. Were women crucified? Do we know? Anybody? Stan, what do you think? Yes. I'm staying out of this one, he says. Well, I did a little looking on this, consulted some books and some references online. I didn't do an intricate research on this, but it would seem likely that women were crucified, although there is only one specific reference that can be found to an actual named female crucified. The key is in a clever historian who found a reference in a Roman legal document to a process for clemency from crucifixion, which says persons can apply for clemency. Doesn't say men. And that leads the historian to believe that both men and women were crucified, although we don't know the women's stories. Even in the story of the cross, there is a Me Too story. We can't know what was on Jesus' mind or Peter's in this interaction. Maybe it was prescient foreknowledge by Jesus, or at least foreshadowing of his own fate. In retrospect, it makes perfect sense, and it could never be shown not to be true. But there is this clue or reason for suggesting that it is all the other crosses that Jesus is either referring to or at least including. The clue being that Jesus is almost never self-referential. He doesn't put himself at the forefront. And I would say that the difference between a religious leader and a cult leader is self-reference. It's not clear what Peter makes of all this, but what we do know is that later, as Jesus is being condemned by the authorities, Peter finds himself in the courtyard, warming his hands before the fire, trying to get lost in the crowd. And there is a servant girl, and she stares at him. This is in Mark 14, later on. And she says, "You're one of his." And Peter famously denies it 3 times. "This is our fire," she says. "You can't warm your hands here. Go warm your hands over your own fire. You're not one of us." The unnamed servant girl and her outing of Peter appears in all four Gospels. Was she mocking him? Was she excluding him? Was she outing his cowardice, his denial of whose fire he really belonged before? You might even say she started Christianity. Peter's self-shame in this moment seemingly launched his future as Peter the Rock. For many years, there has been a fire called Chalmers and a fire called Sydenham. For many years, there's been a fire called Catholicism and a fire called Protestantism. All of us are Peters in some ways. The crowd's fire is safer than the foot of a cross where suffers those seen as enemies of the state. All of us at times pretend to be better Christians than we are, and sometimes act like we have forgotten that we are Christians at all. I know this is true of you only because I know it's true of me. And Lent is such a good time to reflect on ourselves and on the fire that burns within and the fire we identify with and align ourselves to. This is where we begin. Reflection on our own weakness and foibles is not where we end, not where Peter ends. It's where it begins. Lent leads to Easter, where we confront the abuse of power represented by the cross and all the crosses and prepare for new life and new hope. Easter is when Christians again choose their fire. I turned 70 a couple weeks ago. I've been retired for 5 years. I spent 11 years in corrections and then 30 as the chaplain at Queen's. I had a tremendous opportunity for ministry, and I'm so thankful for all those years. The mainline Christian churches are not the same as they were at the beginning of all of that. Christian participation and identification is not the same. It seems in North America that Christianity has either petered out or politicized, one or the other. Some say Christianity has all the answers for questions that no one is asking. Most of us are veterans of a Christian age. But if you're like me, the fire just won't go out. I've denied it, ignored it, got lost in the crowd, lamented the dying embers and its waning warmth. But I get just as mad at the television and the cult leaders who run the world as I ever did, and all the crosses of abuse of power and privilege and indifference and exclusion and inequity. My wife Susan is chaplain at Joyceville Minimum these days, and I'm one of her volunteers. I sometimes drive several Muslim inmates on a pass to Jummah Friday prayer at the mosque. As I arrived the other day, the imam was just getting into his sermon, and as I pulled in and sat down, he said this: "Racism diminishes the light of creation." He was explaining what the Prophet Muhammad had said about racism. I sat there in the mosque prayer room thinking, there is one creation, there is one light, and human life is a covenant with God to uphold that one creation, that one light. And faith is the fire that warms us to passion to live in that one light. And all the crosses, racism, the murder of school children, the poisoned water in the north, the exclusion of a transgendered person, the identification and trolling of enemies of the state is an attempt to extinguish the light of creation. The Prophet Muhammad and the Imam got it right. And I keep thinking of that unnamed servant girl. What was she thinking? We can't know for sure. She warms her hands at the imperial courtyard fire among her own in service to that court. Pretty nervy of her to out this male stranger, imposing himself as one of them. But then again, he's a lone outsider, and she's among her own. Could she have any sense that her shaming of him, forcing his denial, would be the very thing that lights his fire? And then there's us, and these churches, and our own identities, and our own denials, and Jesus' cross, and all the crosses. And but one light, one fire by which to warm our hearts, ignite our passion, feed our hungry souls, keep alive our covenant with God and creation, the fire of faith and hope and justice. Justice being, as American theologian Cornel West says, what love looks like in public. But who do you say that I am? The answer is in the fire by which we choose to live. Amen.